Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Last time in this series of lectures that I've been presenting about the book Al-Kafi, I spoke a little bit about some of the benefits that a non-specialist can derive from reading Ahadith. Specifically, I was talking about the benefit of kind of retracing the steps of a mujtahid. A mujtahid has gone through an intense process of scouring the sources to come up with a strong argument that he can stand by to make a case for either whatever legal ruling, legal opinion he's arrived at. What we can do as non-specialists is to retrace his steps and then see kind of the basis for his conclusion, or at least get a little bit of perspective, so we start to see that his conclusion is not something he's come up with on his own, but it's derived from the words and the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt. So that was kind of the benefit of retracing his steps and actually seeing where the opinion came from. There's another way we can approach the same kind of idea, and we can read Ahadith, not necessarily retracing the steps of the legal reasoning, but read kind of around the fatwa. Read about different Ahadith related to the fatwa, and what we'll get there is we're going to start to see certain elements that we wouldn't, that don't really necessarily make their way into the fatwa. Right? So a fatwa is a legal ruling. It's telling you it's wajib to do this, it's haram to do that, but it doesn't necessarily give you the beauty of the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt in terms of just various elements that they would use to encourage people to do things. So I'm going to kind of go through it and speak about some of these other elements that you'll benefit from if you read around the fatwa of a mujtahid. One thing we'll arrive at is we'll start to see some of the philosophies or the philosophy of law. Right? In the fatwa doesn't reflect the reasoning that the imams sometimes would give for why a particular thing has been made obligatory or made prohibited. So let me give you one example. Previously, I shared with you a hadith that related to what we're allowed to do sajda upon. And the ruling said that it has to be earth or what grows from the earth as long as it's not eaten or not worn. In the continuation of that tradition, the Imam explains why it shouldn't be eaten or worn. He gives the kind of the philosophy behind that prohibition. He says, I'll paraphrase the hadith to save a little bit of time, but he says basically that food and clothing are two of those things that the people who are kind of infatuated with the dunya use to beautify themselves and to kind of establish their status. They're almost like he likens clothing and food to almost the idol of those who are infatuated and kind of subservient to the dunya, to temporal pleasures. And so he says that in sajda, what we're trying to do is we're trying to lower ourselves completely, humble ourselves before our Creator. Now, if we put our head down on earth, that's a very humbling action. It's a humbling action to put your most respected, honorable part of your body on dirt, on earth. But if we were to do sajda on something that's honorable, at least in some people's minds, right? Some people put a lot of honor. What if I started doing sajda on silk, for instance? Right? And silk is such a fine fabric. It's not a humbling fabric at all. It defeats the whole purpose. It kind of goes against the whole reasoning of humbling yourself before God. Food is the same way. If you were to do your sajda on something that's on bread, for instance, or something that has some dignity and honor, then that wouldn't serve the purpose of humbling ourselves before God. So that's not something you'll get from the fatwa itself. But you can get that from the ahadith. So you have the fatwa, you know what the fatwa of your mujtahid is, but then you read a hadith like this, so it kind of gives you a sense of some of the reasoning behind a particular ruling. So it helps us to motivate ourselves and helps us to kind of understand the philosophy behind and act like sajda. Another example for this philosophy is with regard to zakah. So in the rulings for zakah, we are told that on certain kinds of wealth, we have to pay a zakah of 2.5%. Right? There are all sorts of conditions for when and why and how. That's not important for right now, but just I want to focus right now on the amount of 2.5%. Why 2.5%? Why not 3%? Why not more? Why not less? Somebody asked this of the Imam. He says, they ask Imam Rida alayhi salam, لأي شيء جعل الله الزكاة 25 في كل ألف. Right? Why did Allah make it 25%, 25 out of 1,000, 25% that we have to pay in zakah? Why didn't He make it 30? He asks. فقال إن الله عز وجل جعلها 25 أخرج من أموال الأغنياء بقدر ما يكتفي به الفقراء ولو أخرج الناس زكاة أموالهم ما احتاج أحد. He says that Allah has chosen 2.5% because that's exactly how much is needed to fulfill the need of all poor people. He says if all people who are upon whom zakah is wajib, who must pay zakah, if they would just pay their zakah, then there would be no poor people left. Allah has calculated everything. He's determined everything, and He's determined that 2.5% of the wealth of those who are wealthy is enough to suffice those who are poor. That's why He didn't go to 30. That would be excessive. He didn't do less. It would have been too little to suffice everyone. All right. Another thing that we get, a second thing that we get if we read kind of around the ahadith is we get a sense of the incentives and the threats that the imams will sometimes speak in their ahadith that we don't get in the fatwa itself. Now, the fatwa might just say it's haram or it's wajib, but it won't say the consequences. But the imams in their ahadith, they'll sometimes in very, very poignant terms express certain things that are extremely motivating when you read them. Let me share some examples. For instance, one of the things that's clearly haram is to dupe someone in a business dealing or in any sort of thing, to dupe them, to trick them, or to betray someone. They've asked you to keep a secret and you reveal the secret to somebody. Right? Those kinds of actions are definitely haram. But the imams in their phrase, they'll say "Laysa minna man ghasha musliman." Right? Somebody who goes and dupes another Muslim, he's not one of us. Right? It motivates us a lot more. We start to realize, I really better stay away from this because I want to be with the Ahlul Bayt. I don't want them to disown me and disavow me and say he's not one of us because he duped a Muslim. In another hadith, Imam Al-Kafi alayhi salam, he encourages us to do muhasaba, to kind of take account of ourselves on a daily basis. He says, "Laysa minna man lam yuhasib nafsahu fi kulli yawmin." He says, a person who doesn't take account of himself at least once every 24 hours is not one of us. He's not. We're not associated with him. Right? So it's one thing to say, you should do muhasabah. It's mustahab to do muhasabah. That would be the nature of the fatwa. But then to read this kind of a statement in the words of the imam to say, he's going to disown you if you don't do this, that's going to serve to motivate us a lot more to act on this admonishment. Or another example, well, let me give you a positive example where the Imam As-Sadiq alayhi salam says, "Al-Hajj wal-Mu'tamir في ضمان الله فإن مات متوجها غفر الله له ذنوبه." He says the person who goes to perform Hajj or Umrah, he is a beneficiary of a guarantee from Allah. Right? So it's one thing to say it's wajib to do Hajj or it's mustahab to do Umrah. It's another thing to say you now have a guarantee from Allah for the following things. If the person leaves for Hajj, he departs for Hajj, but he dies on the way, he never gets there, then he says that Allah will forgive him for all of his sins. وَإِن مَاتَ مُحْرِمًا بَعَثَهُ اللَّهُ مُلَبِّيًا. If he gets to the miqat, he puts on his ihram, and then he dies, then the guarantee from Allah is that He'll raise him on the Day of Judgment amongst those people who say labbaik Allahumma labbaik, who are at God's service. وَإِن مَاتَ بِأَحَدِ الْحَرَمَيْنِ بَعَثَهُ اللَّهُ مِنَ الْآمِّينَ. And if he dies at one of the two harams, presumably in Medina or in Mecca, without having fulfilled all the rites of Hajj, Allah will raise him amongst those who have performed their Hajj. وَإِن مَاتَ مُنصَرِفًا غَفَرَ اللَّهُ لَهُ جَمِيعَ ذُنُوبِهِ. And then if he fulfills his Hajj, but then he dies on his way back home, then Allah will also forgive all of his sins. Right, so in very almost it seems like exaggerated terms of very very large, generous terms, the Imam is issuing all these guarantees and describing the benefit and the reward of somebody who goes for Hajj or for Umrah. Okay, so that's two benefits. A third one for reading around the fatwas is sometimes the Imams will give kind of metaphorical or descriptive, almost allegorical kind of descriptions of certain obligations that we have. So for instance, there's one, the fatwa would say, for instance, that prayer is wajib, right? You have to pray. Right? That would be the nature of the legal ruling. But the hadith of the Prophet says, مثل الصلاة مثل عمود الفسطاط. He says that the prayer is like the pole that lies at the center of a tent. Right? So he gives us this imagery, this metaphor to help us to understand how crucial, how critical a good prayer is. Right? We say iqamatu salah, that we want our prayer to be established and proper, and we've observed all of the obligations of the prayer. He says it's as important as the tent pole that lies at the middle of a tent. Right? And he goes on to describe it. He says, if that tent pole stands firm, if it's well kind of grounded, and if it's strong and straight and upright, then the tent can rest on it. The ropes that hold it down, the pegs that hold it down, will all be in place, and you'll have an upright tent. Right? He says the prayer is the same way. The tent pole is like our prayer. And the tent itself and all of those, the pegs and the ropes, that's like our life, different aspects of our life. As long as our prayer is upright, then our life is also upright. But if the prayer collapses, our life also collapses. Right? So that kind of imagery, it adds a lot of dimension to the importance of the prayer, and it helps us to realize how significant the prayer really is in our life. Or there's that other hadith that it's probably one that you've heard of before, where the Prophet he likens the prayer to a stream that's running by your house. Right? He says if you had a stream running by your house and 5 times a day you jumped in the stream and washed yourself, how dirty would you be? Right? You wouldn't be dirty at all. You'd be squeaky clean because you've bathed yourself 5 times a day. He says the prayer is like that. Right? 5 times a day we're jumping not with our body but with our soul into the prayer, and the prayer is like a stream that's going to wash clean all of our sins and our imperfections and bring us closer to Allah. It's a beautiful way of describing the prayer, and it has a lot more effect on us spiritually than a simple fatwa which says prayer is wajib. One last benefit I want to mention is that reading these ahadith around the fatwa kind of give us a sense of how the imams themselves, or how their disciples and companions, practiced some of the fatwas that we now have. So again, in the mujtahid's fatwa, he'll say, wudu is wajib, and this is how you do wudu, and you have to do, these 6 things. 3 things are wajib, or 3 things are to be washed, 3 things are to be wiped, and he'll give you in legalistic terms exactly what you have to do. But we have several ahadith. I'll read one to you from Imam al-Baqir's time, where one of his companions actually observes him performing the wudu, and he describes it in detail for us. So we actually see the Imam in action through these words. So the companion Zurara, he says that Imam al-Baqir demonstrated for us the ablution or the wudu of the Messenger of God. So he requested a basin of water, and he entered his right hand into the basin and took a handful of water and poured it over his face from the top of his face. Then with his hand he wiped both of its sides. Then he returned his left hand into the vessel and he poured it over his right hand. Then he wiped its sides. Right? Then he returned his right hand into the vessel and he poured it over his left hand. Then he did with it as he had done with the right. Then with the remainder of what was left on his hands, he wiped on his head and his feet without having returned it into the vessel. So very, very kind of explicitly, Zurara describes what he saw from Imam al-Baqir, and that matches up exactly to what we see in the fatwas of our mujtahids. All right, so that is those are various benefits that we derive from reading fatwas, reading ahadith in light of the fatwas of our mujtahids, to give us a lot more perspective and background on these sorts of things. Another benefit that we can derive from reading ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt is that it gives us it's probably the best sense of what the seerah of the Prophet or the Imams was. The seerah being the kind of the biographical information about the Imam. Like there's one time when you read a biography of him, that's just a story of certain events in his life. But what you get with ahadith is you get these little windows into seeing him in action, seeing exactly how he interacts with people, how he reacts to people. The way we really get to know each other is through interaction, right? Think of the first time you meet somebody, you might exchange certain data, names, and certain information like that about each other, and so you know each other at some very superficial level. But once you start to interact with that person, you start to maybe even have problems with them and conflicts, and you resolve those conflicts, and you see, how when they're happy, when they're sad, and how they act in different circumstances. That's when you get more and more of a sense of what the person really is, who the person really is, and you start to really get to know that person. Unfortunately, because of course, our distance and the time frame, we don't have direct interaction with our imams, but vicariously through the interactions of the companions and the disciples, we do have a window, at least, into the kinds of kind of deep interactions that the companions had with the imams. So let me give you some examples of different ahadith where you get, kind of different colorful kind of images of who the imams were. Personally, this was a really great experience that I had. I felt, because I had read I had read theological arguments for the infallibility of the imams, for the appointment of the imams. Those are very logical, kind of dry statements that are necessary, but they're dry by nature. I had read biographies of the Prophet or some of the imams, but it wasn't until I started reading ahadith that I really started to feel like now I'm getting to know who they really were. All right, so let me share some of these ahadith with you. There's one from Hisham ibn al-Hakam, and he says that he had a whole series of questions, something on the order of 500 questions he mentioned, and they used to come to Hajj on a yearly basis, where they could approach the imam and ask their questions and come away with clarifications on various issues. So he said he had 500 questions about kalam, about theological issues. He came to Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam and he asked them, and he would say, our opposition, they're claiming such and such, what should I say? The Imam said, well, if they say such and such, you should say such and such. Next, second question, he would ask the same thing. And so one after the other, these 500 questions, he asked them and received answers from the Imam. At the end of this whole session, Hisham, he goes to the Imam, he tells the Imam, he says, I knew that you were an expert in halal and haram. Like I understood, I knew that you were the most knowledgeable person about fiqh, but this is kalam, this is theology that I'm asking about. I didn't realize you were so knowledgeable in this as well. All right, so it kind of gives you an idea that Hisham ibn al-Hakam was an outstanding companion, but they had a kind of a learning curve. He was a convert at first, and it took time before they actually realized, even though they're interacting with the imam, it took time for them to realize exactly the depth of the imam's knowledge. And so this is kind of a special moment for Hisham, where he suddenly saw a whole new aspect of the imam for himself. And so the imam responds and he says that, of course, Allah has sent me as a hujjah, and he'll never, he always provides someone to guide people in all of the areas of knowledge that they need. And so, you need guidance in fiqh, but you also need guidance in theology. I have it all. I'm a resource for both. In another tradition, this is in Usul Al-Kafi, in the Book of Knowledge. A person comes and asks Imam Sadiq. He says that there's a situation where this person was infected with smallpox, and he became junub, right? Through something, he became in the state of janaba, and he needed to be purified before he could say his prayers and these sorts of things. The people didn't know what to do. They didn't know whether, usually you have to take a ghusl to get rid of the state of janaba. But this person was with smallpox, and apparently, smallpox, people who are infected with that, water is very harmful for them. Not knowing what exactly their duty was, they bathed him. Right? They bathed this person who had smallpox, and he died. Right? The stress or whatever was too much, and he ended up dying because of that. So this person comes and asks the imam. He says, did they do the right thing or not? Are they liable for his death or not? The imam says they killed him. Why did they not ask? Asking is the antidote to ignorance. Right? So just seeing the reaction of the imam, that they've killed him. They're murderers. They should have asked. In ignorance, they did this thing. If they had only asked me, I would have told them that no, don't give him a ghusl, and tayammum is perfectly fine to get rid of the situation of janaba, and you can preserve his life and you can fulfill his duty at the same time. Another tradition tells of this person by the name of Hamza ibn Tayyar. So he was the son of a person named Muhammad at-Tayyar, who was a scholar in his own right, also a follower of the Ahlul Bayt, and apparently a companion of Imam Baqir alayhi salam. So the son comes to Imam Sadiq, And he says, I presented to Abu Abdullah one of his father's sermons. It's not clear whether he's saying one of Imam Baqir's sermons or one of his own Muhammad's sermons. But in any case, he presents a sermon. He's reading out of a book to Imam as-Sadiq and saying, this is one of your father's sermons that's been recorded by my father, or it's one of my father's own sermons. Then he gets to a particular section in the reading, and the Imam says, cease and be silent. He tells the person basically, be quiet, don't continue, stop right there. In the face of issues that arise to which you do not know the answer, you must simply refrain from speaking, exercise caution, and refer to the guided Imams so they can place you in that regard on the right path. And he continues a little bit. So just again, that reaction that the Imam had, this person had apparently read something that possibly, we don't know exactly, but we can infer that he had either said something wrong, or he had said something that he didn't understand properly, or he made a mistake, but he didn't, or he had a question but he didn't ask the Imam. He did something wrong, and he didn't kind of remedy it by asking a question or by asking for clarification from the Imam who's sitting in front of him. And so the Imam is very, very almost violent in his reaction to him, and he tells him that you stop right there. When you have a point of doubt, you must ask. Don't keep on talking. Don't keep on saying things when you have no basis for what you're saying. In one other tradition, we kind of get a glimpse at the culture of scholarship in the times of the Imams. I mentioned before how some of the companions would keep these jotters, these kind of notebooks where they would record all of the ahadith that they were hearing from the Imam or collecting from other people. And in one hadith, Abdullah ibn Sinan, one of the really strong companions of Imam as-Sadiq, he says, I told Abu Abdullah, people come to me and listen to me transmit your traditions, but I feel weary and do not have the strength to read every tradition for them. So his description itself tells us that there's this culture of, for instance, someone like Abdullah, who's one of the prominent companions of the Imam, would have a notebook or a jotter or maybe several books, and other people would recognize him as the access point to the Imam, and they would come and they would ask him to share his book with them. So either most likely he would read from the book, dictate what he had written, and they would copy down everything that he had written, or he would give them the book. And then they would read it as they're writing it. Somehow there would be that exchange as the dictation and the writing occurs. But Abdullah says that I get kind of tired. Maybe he's old or for whatever reason. He says sometimes I'm tired. I don't feel like reading the entire book to them. So the Imam says, if that's the case, then read for them a tradition from the beginning of your jotter, a tradition from the middle, and a tradition from the end. He says, as a solution, just read one from the beginning, one from the middle, and one from the end, and then let them copy the rest of it from your book. Now, there might be a couple of explanations for why he said this. It could be that if you imagine everything's handwritten, and people have their own particular handwriting styles that sometimes are difficult to interpret. So he would give his notebook over to these people to write, and he would read just a couple of examples, one from the beginning, middle, and end, just so they get an idea of what his handwriting looks like. Right, so they hear him and they see what the writing is, and they figure out, when he writes this, that's what he means, and this is what he means, and so they get a clue of that. Or it could be that the Imam is trying to just maintain this kind of formal aspect of human exchange of knowledge. Right, we're constantly encouraged to seek knowledge from scholars, from people, not simply from tools and books and computers and these sorts of things, but actually from human interaction. You need a teacher over you to not only teach you the information, but to show you how to live it, how to apply it to yourselves and to your lives. And so the Imam wants to at least preserve that sort of relationship of teacher to student. So even if he's not going to read the entire book to them, at least he reads a couple of hadith from the two ends in the middle to preserve that form of connection. So it gives us kind of a hint as to this process that they engaged in during that time for exchanging knowledge. So in conclusion, we through these ahadith we get this glimpse into the lives of the Imams. So we start to see that color and kind of the various aspects of the Imams in their interactions with different people and under different circumstances, and it gives us a much more colorful idea of who the Imams were. Inshallah, until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.